The stage lights burned bright, illuminating the grand television studio as the cameras rolled. Morgan Freeman sat in his chair, calm and composed, exuding the wisdom that had made him a legend. Across from him sat Daniel Cross, a young and ambitious journalist known for his aggressive interviewing style. Millions of viewers tuned in, expecting a standard celebrity interview, but tonight, something felt different. The air was charged, heavy with unspoken tension. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes sharp with intent. "Mr. Freeman," he began, his voice steady but edged with challenge, "you've built a career on wisdom and storytelling, but how much of it is real? How much of Morgan Freeman is just an illusion?" The words cut through the studio like a blade, and a murmur rippled through the live audience. This wasn't a casual interview, it was an interrogation, a test. Morgan took a measured breath, his deep voice steady. "That's an interesting question," he said, a small smile playing at his lips. He didn't rush to defend himself, nor did he look rattled. Instead, he let the moment hang, allowing Daniel to stew in the weight of his own words. The silence stretched, creating an unspoken battle of wills. Daniel shifted slightly, sensing that his usual tactics wouldn't work here. The journalist pressed on, unwilling to back down. "You've narrated some of the greatest stories ever told. People listen to you as if you're a prophet. But tell me this, how do we know that Morgan Freeman isn't just reading another script?" The challenge was direct, and the crowd gasped at the audacity. It wasn't just a question, it was an accusation. He was implying that Freeman's wisdom was rehearsed, that his authenticity was nothing more than performance. Morgan finally leaned forward, his hands clasped together. His expression remained calm, but there was an unmistakable fire in his eyes. "Let me ask you something, young man," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "When a great actor delivers a role with truth, does that make the emotions any less real? Does the power of a story disappear simply because it was told with intention?" His words were slow, deliberate, each syllable carrying an undeniable presence. Daniel hesitated, momentarily caught off guard. He had expected deflection, maybe even irritation, but not this. Morgan wasn't playing defense. He was challenging the very premise of the question. The audience leaned in, sensing that something profound was about to unfold. The interview was no longer just a routine discussion. It had become a battleground of ideals, and Morgan Freeman was about to turn the tables. A hush fell over the audience, anticipation thick in the air. Daniel Cross shifted in his seat, visibly recalibrating his approach. He was used to rattling his guests, forcing them to stumble over their own words. But Morgan Freeman was unfazed, his presence unshaken. The veteran actor had seen too much, lived too long to be easily cornered. Daniel exhaled and decided to push further. "So you're saying that performance and truth can be the same thing?" he asked, voice laced with skepticism. "That as long as the delivery is convincing, the words carry meaning?" He leaned in, his youthful arrogance barely concealed. "Isn't that dangerous? In a world full of lies, how do we know who to trust?" Morgan let the question linger, his gaze never wavering. Then, with the measured patience of a man who had nothing to prove, he spoke. "Truth is not in the words, Mr. Cross. It's in the way they live in people's hearts." His voice, deep and steady, wrapped around the studio like a warm embrace. "A great story is not great because it was spoken well. It's great because it awakens something real inside the listener." The audience stirred. Something about Morgan's words struck deeper than mere rhetoric. He wasn't simply answering a question, he was opening a door to something much larger. Even Daniel seemed to feel it, though he wasn't ready to admit it. He straightened his tie, refusing to let Morgan take control of the conversation. "That's a poetic answer," Daniel said, forcing a smirk, "but it's also an easy one. You say people should trust their hearts. What if their hearts deceive them? What if the world isn't as noble as your stories make it seem?" For the first time, Morgan's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing slightly. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet power that silenced the room. And what if the world is exactly as noble as we choose to see it? He leaned forward, his presence suddenly immense. What if stories exist not to deceive, but to remind us of what we're capable of who we are at our best? Daniel opened his mouth to counter, but nothing came. The question had flipped the entire conversation on its head. The audience erupted in quiet murmurs, their reactions split between awe and contemplation. The young journalist had come to expose Morgan Freeman as a performer, a man whose wisdom was just another script. But now, it seemed, Morgan was revealing something far more dangerous, truth spoken with conviction. And truth, when wielded correctly, had the power to shake the very foundations of doubt. Daniel Cross felt the weight of Morgan Freeman's words settle over him like an unexpected storm. He had come prepared for a fight, armed with sharp questions and calculated skepticism. Yet, somehow, Morgan wasn't just answering. He was dismantling the very foundation of Daniel's argument. The journalist shifted in his seat, forcing himself to regain composure. He couldn't lose control of the conversation, not now. "I see what you're doing," Daniel said, a hint of defiance in his voice. "You're turning this into a lesson instead of an answer." He gestured toward the audience as if exposing a magician's trick. "You speak with wisdom, with poetry, and people believe you. But how do we separate inspiration from manipulation?" His words cut through the air, heavy with implication. He wanted the audience to doubt. He wanted Morgan to falter, but Morgan didn't falter. Instead, he exhaled softly, studying the young man before him. "You're asking the wrong question," he said, voice rich with patience. "The real question isn't whether my words can be manipulated. It's whether people are willing to listen, not just to me, but to themselves." He tilted his head slightly. "You see, truth doesn't need permission to exist. It simply is. Whether you believe it or not, that's up to you." A murmur rippled through the crowd. There was something unnerving about Morgan's unwavering certainty. Daniel felt it too, a quiet discomfort creeping into his chest. He had spent years challenging authority, dissecting public figures, revealing the cracks in their polished facades. But Morgan wasn't cracking, he wasn't performing, he was simply being, and that somehow made him more dangerous than any politician or celebrity Daniel had ever faced. The journalist cleared his throat, grasping for control. "So you're saying truth is subjective?" he challenged. "That anyone can believe anything and call it truth?" He thought he had him. Now, a logical trap. But Morgan only smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. "No," he said simply, "I'm saying that truth is like light. It doesn't care whether you see it. It just is." The words hung in the air, undeniable. Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but found that for the first time in his career he had nothing to say. The tension in the studio was no longer just between Daniel and Morgan. It had spread to the audience, to the very walls of the room. It was the kind of moment that felt larger than the sum of its parts, like something profound was about to be unearthed. Daniel Cross knew he had lost control of the conversation, but he wasn't ready to surrender. He inhaled sharply, regaining his composure. "All right, Mr. Freeman," he said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of frustration. "Let's talk about reality. People trust you. They hear your voice in documentaries, in movies, in speeches, and they believe you. But what if you're wrong? What if your words give people false hope?" His eyes locked onto Morgan's, searching for a crack in the older man's armor. Morgan tilted his head slightly, as if considering the weight of the question. Then, with the ease of a man who had lived through storms far worse, he spoke. "Hope is never false, Mr. Cross," he said, his voice smooth as rolling thunder. "It is the foundation of every great change in history. Without hope, we do nothing. We change nothing." His words carried a gravity that made the air feel heavier, like the very fabric of the room had shifted. Daniel scoffed, though there was an unmistakable tightness in his throat. "That's idealistic," he argued. "The world isn't a movie. People don't always win in the end. Bad things happen. People lie, they cheat, they suffer, and sometimes no amount of wisdom or storytelling can change that." There it was, his real argument, laid bare. It wasn't just about Morgan Freeman. It was about something much bigger. A deep-seated cynicism that had grown inside Daniel for years. Morgan studied him carefully, then leaned back, folding his hands in his lap. "You think I don't know that?" he said, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. "I have seen the worst of this world, Mr. Cross. I have seen injustice, cruelty, and despair. But do you know what I've also seen?" He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I have seen people rise above it. I have seen kindness where none was expected. I have seen the power of a single voice to change the course of history." Daniel swallowed, his bravado flickering. Something about Morgan's words hit deeper than he had anticipated. For the first time, he wasn't just debating a public figure, he was confronting his own beliefs. And as much as he wanted to deny it, a part of him was starting to wonder if he had been wrong all along. The studio remained eerily silent, the weight of Morgan's words hanging thick in the air. Even the camera operators, trained to remain detached, seemed caught in the moment, their focus locked onto the unfolding exchange. Daniel Cross sat motionless, his carefully crafted arguments unraveling before him. The script he had prepared, the narrative he had built, it all felt suddenly hollow. For the first time, his voice wavered. "But what if people put their faith in the wrong stories?" he asked, his tone no longer combative, but almost pleading. "What if they believe in something that isn't real, and it leads them nowhere?" His question was no longer about Morgan Freeman. It was about himself, about his own fears, his own doubts. The young journalist who had prided himself on his skepticism was now searching for something deeper. Morgan saw it, the crack in Daniel's armor, the hidden wound beneath all the cynicism. He leaned forward, his presence as steady as ever. "The beauty of a story, Mr. Cross, is that it is never just one thing," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "A story is a mirror. It shows us what we choose to see. The question is not whether a story is real. The question is what it awakens in us." The words struck something deep within Daniel, something he hadn't even realized was there. For years he had viewed the world through the lens of doubt, assuming that belief was nothing more than a trick, a deception. But now, faced with the quiet conviction of a man who had spent a lifetime shaping narratives, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. A long pause filled the space between them. Then, for the first time that night, Daniel exhaled and allowed himself to simply listen. "So what do you see?" he asked, his voice softer now. "When you look at the world?" It was no longer a challenge. It was a genuine question, a plea. For an answer he had never been able to find on his own. Morgan Freeman smiled, not in victory, not in condescension, but in understanding. "I see what I choose to see," he said. "I see hope. I see resilience, and I see the power of a voice, no matter how small, to shape something greater than itself." He let the words settle, then leaned back, watching as the realization dawned in Daniel's eyes. It wasn't about truth versus illusion. It was about what one chose to believe in. A slow murmur rippled through the studio audience. Something had changed, not just in the conversation, but in the atmosphere itself. Daniel Cross, the sharp, unshakable journalist, sat in silence. His usual confidence had been stripped away, leaving only a man grappling with a truth he had never dared to consider. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of the transformation unfolding before millions of viewers. Daniel finally spoke, but his voice was different now, lower, uncertain. "Maybe I've been looking at this all wrong," he admitted. more to himself than to Morgan. "I've spent so much time questioning everything, trying to expose flaws, that I never stopped to ask what people actually need." He ran a hand through his hair, his earlier aggression completely gone. "Maybe people don't need to be reminded of what's broken. Maybe they need to believe that something better is possible." Morgan smiled, his eyes filled with quiet approval. "That, Mr. Cross," he said, "is why we tell stories." His voice, steady as ever, felt less like an argument and more like an invitation to see the world through a different lens. Cynicism is easy. It costs nothing. But hope? That takes courage. It takes faith. And faith is not about knowing everything. It's about choosing to believe in something greater than yourself. The studio remained silent, the gravity of Morgan's words settling in. Daniel Cross, a man who had built his career on skepticism, found himself at a crossroads. The cameras were still rolling, the audience still watching, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about the show, the ratings, or the headlines. He was thinking about the truth, not the kind that exposed, but the kind that built something new. He exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. "You really do have a way with words," he said, a small, almost reluctant smile breaking across his face. "And the worst part is, I think you might actually be right." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, breaking the tension that had hung in the air for so long. Morgan chuckled, his deep, warm laughter filling the room. "It's not about being right," he said. "It's about asking the right questions." He leaned back in his chair, satisfied. The battle of wills was over. But more importantly, something had shifted, not just in the studio, but in the hearts of those who had listened. As the show wrapped up, Daniel Cross glanced toward the camera, his usual polished sign-off feeling strangely inadequate. Instead, he looked back at Morgan Freeman, eyes filled with something new, respect, curiosity, maybe even hope. He extended his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. Morgan took it with a knowing smile, and with that, the interview that had begun as a confrontation ended as something entirely different, a moment of truth shared with the world.